30,000 years ago, the world tried to kill every human on Earth, not with a single catastrophic event, not with an asteroid, not with a volcano, with something far more patient, far more ruthless, and far more complete. A cold so deep and so vast that it swallowed entire continents. Ice sheets 2 miles thick pressing down on land that used to be forest. Temperatures plunging so low that the ocean itself began to freeze at the edges. And somewhere in the middle of all that, tiny, naked, fragile creatures made mostly of water somehow didn't die. That's the part nobody talks about, because the real story isn't about glaciers advancing across Europe. You've heard that part. The real story is about what humans actually did in the darkness, in the cold, in the desperation of a world that had stopped cooperating with their survival. And some of what they did was extraordinary, and some of it was disturbing. And a few things they did we still can't fully explain. Here's what's strange. About 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano in what is now Indonesia erupted with a force so massive that it darkened skies globally for years. Geneticists studying ancient DNA found something unsettling in the aftermath. The human population didn't just decline, it nearly winked out entirely. Some estimates put the surviving population at fewer than 10,000 individuals. Maybe as low as a few thousand. For a moment in history, the entire human species could have fit inside a small sports stadium. They made it, but the question that keeps paleontologists, archaeologists, and geneticists up at night isn't whether our ancestors survived the Ice Age. Obviously they did. You're here. The question is how. What did they know? What did they do? What did they sacrifice? And perhaps most strangely, what did they discover about themselves in the process that we've almost entirely forgotten? The answers are not what anyone expected. To understand what survival actually looked like, you need to understand how brutal the last glacial maximum really was. We're talking about a period roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago when the ice was at its absolute worst. The British Isles were buried under glaciers. Scandinavia didn't exist as a landscape, it was just ice. Northern Asia was a frozen wasteland. North America had an ice sheet so enormous it reshaped the continent's entire drainage system. And here's the thing people don't picture correctly. It wasn't just cold. Cold you could maybe manage. The real problem was that the Ice Age destroyed the food as temperatures dropped. The lush forests that animals depended on contracted into small, isolated pockets. Grasslands expanded in some areas, shrank catastrophically in others. Species that had provided protein for tens of thousands of years simply vanished. Woolly mammoths, cave lions, cave bears, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet, the megafauna that ancient humans had co-evolved with as hunters were disappearing in real time. And humans had built their entire survival strategy around these animals. When the prey disappeared, the predator had to make a choice: adapt completely, or die. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the choice that ancient humans made wasn't the obvious one. It wasn't just migration. It wasn't just better spears. What the archaeological record reveals is a suite of behavioral and technological revolutions happening almost simultaneously across different populations that had no contact with each other. As if the cold forced every surviving human group to independently arrive at the same desperate innovations. Anthropologists call this phenomenon convergent cultural evolution, and the timing is striking. Around 40,000 years ago, just as conditions were deteriorating, there is a sudden dramatic explosion in the sophistication of human behavior. Cave paintings appear, bone needles appear, long-distance trade networks appear, sophisticated shelter construction appears, musical instruments appear, and not gradually, fast. It's almost like the cold didn't just challenge humans. It accelerated them, but that still doesn't explain the most puzzling part. And this is the part that changes the story completely. It sounds too simple, too obvious, but here's the real revelation buried inside something that seems mundane. Researchers studying lice, specifically the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, discovered something remarkable. Body lice, which live exclusively in clothing, diverged from head lice approximately 170,000 years ago. That means humans were wearing fitted, sewn clothing at least 170,000 years before the last glacial maximum. Before most people assume humans were capable of that kind of thinking, but the sophistication wasn't just in wearing animal skins. That anyone could do. The sophistication was in the needle. The oldest known bone needle was found in Siberia's Denisovan cave and dated to at least 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years. This wasn't a crude piercing tool. It had an eye. It was designed for threading, for sewing fitted seams, for creating layered, insulated garments that trap body heat the way modern, technical clothing does. And it was made by a hominid species we didn't even know existed until 2010. The Denisovans, which opens an entirely different door, because ancient DNA research has now confirmed that modern humans didn't survive the Ice Age alone. We survived it partly by absorbing the knowledge and the genetics of other human species who had already been living in harsh cold environments for hundreds of thousands of years longer than we had. Think about what that means for a moment. When anatomically modern humans pushed into Ice Age Eurasia, they encountered Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia. They encountered Denisovans across a vast stretch of Asia from Siberia to Southeast Asia. And what the genetics show is that they didn't just fight these groups. They didn't just compete. They interbred extensively. And the genes they inherited weren't random, they were functional, adaptive, specifically useful for cold environments. the gene variants modern Tibetan people carry that allow them to survive at extreme altitudes with reduced oxygen, those came from the Denisovans, the immune system adaptations that allowed humans to fight off pathogens in new environments. Many came from Neanderthal DNA, skin and hair adaptations suited to lower UV light in northern latitudes, Neanderthal. Even the fat distribution patterns that help bodies conserve heat in extreme cold, researchers are finding Neanderthal genomic signatures embedded in populations whose ancestors lived through the worst of the glaciation. Our species didn't just survive the Ice Age on its own cleverness. It survived partly by cannibalizing the evolutionary wisdom of beings it was simultaneously replacing. That's not a comfortable story, but it's the true one. Here's where the story takes a turn most people never see coming. The places where ancient humans chose to survive the worst of the Ice Age weren't caves deep in frozen tundra. They were refugia, specific geographic pockets where a combination of ocean currents, elevation, and local geology kept temperatures just survivable enough. In Europe, one of the primary refugia was southwestern France and northern Spain, the Dordogne region. In Asia, pockets along river valleys in what is now China. In Africa, parts of the southern and eastern coast where marine resources provided year-round food. These weren't random choices. Ancient humans had somehow mapped survivable geography, but inside these refugia something strange was happening that no one expected the archaeological record to reveal. The cave paintings, the art, the explosion of symbolic thinking that defines what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, it was concentrated precisely in these survival zones. Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, these aren't just art galleries of the ancient world. They're the interior walls of the places where humanity decided to hold its ground against extinction. And some researchers now believe that wasn't a coincidence. The leading hypothesis, controversial but gaining traction, is that symbolic thinking, art, ritual, storytelling, music, wasn't a luxury that emerged after survival was secured. It was itself a survival technology. The ability to tell a story about a mammoth hunt before the hunt, to plan symbolically, gave groups who could do it a decisive advantage over those who couldn't. The ability to encode knowledge in ritual and image meant that critical survival information survived individual human deaths. When an elder who knew where the fish ran in spring died without passing on that knowledge, the group suffered. When that knowledge was encoded in a painting on a cave wall or a song repeated in ceremony, it outlasted any single person's lifespan. Art was memory storage. Ritual was database management. Storytelling was the original information technology. And the groups that cracked the system are the ones whose descendants are reading about them today. But even this explanation doesn't fully account for one of the most striking puzzles the Ice Age left behind. You already know humans used fire. Everyone knows humans used fire. But you don't know this part. Archaeologists working in South Africa's Pinnacle Point caves found evidence of controlled fire use going back 1 million years. But that's not the revelation. The revelation is what they found next to the fire. Ochre, red mineral pigment ground into powder and mixed with animal fat. Shells with drilled holes. Tools made from materials transported from 60 miles away. Signs of trade networks, symbolic decoration, planned cognition, all clustered around fire sites. Fire wasn't just warmth. Fire was civilization's first room. The social technology of fire fundamentally changed human cognition and human social structure. Firelight extended the waking day into nighttime hours, and those nighttime hours, protected from predators, sheltered from cold, became something unprecedented in primate evolution. They became hours for talking, for storytelling, for social bonding that didn't require physical grooming, for teaching the young, for processing grief, for planning, for the transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations in structured, memorable narrative form. Without fire, humans sleep when it gets dark and wake when it gets light, exactly like every other primate. With fire, you get something entirely new. You get culture. Consistent, transmissible, cumulative culture that builds on itself generation after generation rather than resetting with every death. And here's the specific part that changes how you think about Ice Age survival. Controlled fire, the ability to carry it, to restart it reliably, to maintain it through weather, was not a given. It was a skill. A dangerous, difficult, catastrophically consequential skill. Populations that lost fire in deep winter didn't get second chances. The groups that survived were the groups that developed the social and technical infrastructure to ensure fire never went out. Researchers studying Ice Age habitation sites have found something telling. In the harshest climatic periods, human habitation sites cluster more tightly together, not because humans were retreating from the cold only geographically, but because they were retreating socially, forming larger, more cohesive, more cooperative groups, sharing fire, sharing food, sharing information, and excluding outsiders. Which brings us to truth about Ice Age survival that is fascinating, dark, and completely unreported. The Ice Age didn't just select for intelligence. It selected for tribalism. In an environment where resources were catastrophically scarce, where a bad winter could mean starvation, where every animal you failed to catch was a meal your children didn't eat, cooperation within the group was essential, and competition with other groups was existential. And the archaeological record shows what this produced. Evidence of violence, skeletal trauma consistent with blunt force injury, signs of warfare that predate agriculture, Cave sites showing evidence of hasty abandonment, as if people fled rather than left deliberately. The Ice Age was not a peaceful crucible of human ingenuity. It was a pressure cooker that baked competition and cooperation into the same species simultaneously. We became deeply tribal and deeply cooperative at exactly the same moment because the environment demanded both. You needed your group to survive. You needed your group to be strong enough to defend what it had. And this is where something subtle but profound enters the story. Diet. The caloric math of Ice Age survival was brutal. A human body in deep cold burns significantly more calories just maintaining core temperature. At the same time, food sources were unreliable, intermittent, and often dangerous to obtain. The solution ancient humans arrived at independently repeatedly across multiple populations was one that nutritional researchers are still arguing about today: high-fat, high-protein diets, bone marrow, brain matter, organs consumed immediately after a kill because they're the most calorie-dense parts of any animal, fat rendered and stored, and something else, fermented foods. Evidence of intentional fermentation, allowing food to partially decompose under controlled conditions to make it last longer, and to extract nutrients that raw or lightly cooked food doesn't provide, appears in the archaeological record far earlier than most people realize. Ancient humans were preserving food through fermentation tens of thousands of years before they had pottery, using skins as containers, burying food in permafrost, nature's freezer, and returning to caches weeks or months later. Building supply chains across hundreds of miles. This wasn't primitive survival. This was logistics. This was planning. This was a level of executive function and time horizon thinking that required brains operating at full modern cognitive capacity. And the Ice Age was the crucible that forged it, but none of this is the biggest piece. Save it. Because what comes next changes everything you thought you understood about our species: population genetics. For decades, the story of human Ice Age survival was told as a story of resilience. Humans endured, humans adapted, humans pushed through, and that story is true. But the genetic data tells a parallel story that is far more alarming and far more revealing about how close the whole experiment came to ending: multiple population bottlenecks. That's the clinical term. What it means in reality is this. Multiple times in human prehistory, the population crashed so severely that the genetic diversity of the entire species was compressed down to something resembling a small, isolated town. Not a nation, not a region. A few thousand individuals whose genetics then propagated to become the billions of people alive today. The bottleneck associated with the Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago is the most dramatic, but there were others. Each major glacial advance left genetic signatures, reduced heterozygosity, increased evidence of genetic drift that tell the story of population collapse and recovery. Again and again, and here's the part that's truly staggering. Every time the population crashed, the survivors weren't necessarily the strongest. They weren't necessarily the smartest in any individual sense. They were the luckiest. They were the ones who happened to be in the right refugium at the right time. They were the groups that happened to have a charismatic leader who kept people together when the instinct was to scatter. They were the bands that happened to stumble into a river valley with fish when the herds had moved. The human genome is not a record of superior design. It is a record of survival by the thinnest possible margins, of fortune as much as fitness, of accidents of geography that preserved certain lineages while eliminating others who may have been equally capable, equally innovative, equally intelligent. Which means that human civilization, all of it, the entire accumulated achievement of our species, sits on a foundation built by a handful of Ice Age survivors who had no idea what they were building. And the tools they built it with, most of them are still inside you. Here's what the last 20 years of research have made undeniable, and what almost no mainstream coverage has fully connected. The experience of surviving repeated catastrophic near-extinction events didn't just shape human technology. It shaped human psychology at the biological level. The anxiety response that feels so maladaptive in modern life, hypervigilance, pattern recognition defaulting to threat detection, intense social monitoring of group dynamics, deep sensitivity to exclusion, these are Ice Age survival mechanisms running on 21st century hardware. The tendency to categorize people instantly as in-group or out-group, the comfort derived from shared ritual and narrative, the profound psychological pain of social isolation. The way stories feel more real to us than statistics. The compulsive need to understand cause and effect even when none exists. The way humans will follow a confident leader into disaster rather than accept the terrifying uncertainty of leaderless decision-making. Every one of these tendencies was adaptive in a world where your group of 40 was the only thing standing between you and dying alone in the dark. And here is the piece that ties everything together. The thing that the cave paintings, the bone needles, the fire circles, the genetic bottlenecks, the Neanderthal DNA, the fermented food caches, and the tribal warfare all point toward: human beings are not the species that conquered the Ice Age. Human beings are the species the Ice Age made, not our technology, not our art, not our social structures, us, our minds, our drives, our fears, our loves, our irrational need for stories that make sense of random suffering. Our willingness to die for people we're genetically related to and kill people we're not. Our capacity for extraordinary compassion inside the group and extraordinary cruelty at its borders. Our hunger for meaning in an environment that offers none automatically. All of it came out of that cold. All of it was sculpted by 10,000 years of pressure that no modern human has ever experienced, and that shaped every human who will ever live. The last ice age ended approximately 11,700 years ago. The glaciers retreated. The megafauna that hadn't already been hunted to extinction died off as their ecosystems collapsed. The survivors scattered, genetically compressed, psychologically transformed, began to spread out of the refugia into a warming world. Within 2,000 years they invented agriculture. Within 5,000 cities. Within 10,000, you're reading this on a device that processes more information per second than all of human prehistory combined. That speed, that explosion of complexity, researchers increasingly believe it wasn't accidental. The 40,000 years of cultural accumulation that happened inside the Ice Age refugia, the art, the ritual, the trade networks, the sophisticated tool technology, the social organization created a compressed reservoir of cognitive and cultural capital that released explosively the moment environmental pressure eased. The Ice Age wasn't an obstacle to civilization. It was the rehearsal. And somewhere in a cave in southwestern France on a wall that hasn't seen daylight in 17,000 years, someone pressed their hand into red ochre and pushed it against cold stone, and left it there. A signal across time, not to anyone in particular, just proof in the darkness that they existed, that they held on, that they didn't disappear. They couldn't have known that everything that came after, every city, every war, every symphony, every satellite, every word ever written was downstream from that moment of desperate, beautiful human persistence.